Form errors are created when a form is submitted with data that doesn't pass all the data validations that we've put in the model. We'll discuss validating data in depth in the next chapter, but while we're on the subject of forms, let's go ahead and talk about how to display any form errors that come up. So we can have some errors to look at. We'll start by using a simple validation. I'll have validates underscore presence underscore of, and then the attribute, which in this case I'm just going to use name. So we want to make sure there's some value present. This is the most basic validation that there is. If it turns out the form has been submitted without the name value present, then it will add an error into the array of errors on the object. So if we're working with subject, it would be subject.errors, page.errors, section.errors. Each active record object has its own array of errors. And then if a create or an update fails, we'll be able to examine that array of errors to see what went wrong. There's some other useful methods for errors that we can look at. We can clear the errors. We can see how large they are. We can iterate through them just like we would a normal array. Notice though that there's two values that are yielded up. The first is the attribute that has the error, and the second is the message about what went wrong. And it is possible for an attribute to have more than one message associated with it. There could be more than one thing that's wrong. Now using this each loop, we could go through and construct our own custom message about what was wrong with each attribute. But it's even easier to use Rails default messages, where it takes the attribute of the message and turns it into an English sentence for us. So object.errors.full-messages will return an array that we can then iterate through, which just has simple English sentences about what went wrong. This is the one you'll use the most often. Now before Rails 3, there was a helper method called error messages for that you could use. You could say error messages for whatever object it was, and it would output HTML with all of the full messages listed, showing what was wrong. But there was one big problem with it. It wasn't very configurable, and the HTML was buried deep inside of Rails. And they decided that just really wasn't a good idea to have HTML in there, not configurable and part of the framework. So instead, they moved it out for Rails version 3 and moved it into a plugin called Dynamic Form. So if you want that same functionality, you can go out and download the Dynamic Form plugin and you'll have error messages for available to you. However, I encourage you not to go that route. Instead, we're going to write our own because it's just as easy to write our own HTML code, and then it's going to be in a template, in a partial where it's nice and configurable, and we'll put that in the shared folder so that we have access through it throughout our application. And that's what I'm going to walk you through how to do now. Let's jump over to our application. Let's start out by going to our models, and let's add that validation. So I'm going to put it on the subject model, and I like to put mine right below my relationships. Validates presence of name. So that's going to make sure that the subject always has a name. Whenever we're creating a subject or updating a subject, we need to make sure that we have a name. So let's save it, and let's just try it out without doing anything else to just get an idea of what that does. So let's go into our terminal, Rails server, and then let's go into Firefox and go to localhost 3000 subjects. And from here, we'll do add a new subject. And let's just try submitting it without putting in a name. Just create subject, and you'll see that create didn't succeed. Now, it doesn't look like it gave us any kind of notification about the errors, and that's the kind of thing we want to fix. However, don't be fooled into thinking it didn't do anything for you. It actually did something very subtle but very nice. If we view the page source, we look down here at name, you'll see that right after the name, before the input, it wraps the input in a div tag with the class field with errors. That's one of the nice things about using the Rails helpers, is that it added this CSS around the field that had a problem so that we could style it if we want to. We don't have to, but if we wanted to, we could turn it a different color, we could put a border around it or something like that to draw the user's attention to it and let them know that it has an error in it. Now, it doesn't tell us what the error was, it just tells us where the error is. In order to tell it what the error was, we need to use those messages that are in the errors array. So let's do that now. So we'll switch back to our application, and inside the shared folder is where I'm going to create this template. So I'll create a new one, and it's going to be called underscore error messages, plural, .html.erb. There we go. That'll give me my partial that I can then work with. And I've got it in the shared folder because I'll be using it for my subjects, for my pages, for my sections, from a lot of different places in my application. Now, rather than have you watch me type all of this in, I'm just going to paste in the HTML and Ruby code that I'll be using. So it starts out with a conditional. If there's an object, and if the object has errors that are greater than 0, then output some HTML. It'll be called the error explanation. That'll give me the ability to style it in my CSS. Then you'll notice I'm using the pluralize helper here, so I get a nice readable message. It'll either say 1 error prohibited or 3 errors prohibited, this record from being saved. And then there were problems with the following fields. And then I have an unordered list, and it goes through object.errors.fullMessages, and then takes each one of those messages and just outputs them one after another. So give me back a list of all the errors that exist. Let's save this and make a note that we need to make sure that object has a value when we call this partial. So I think the best place to call this from is going to be from the form partial. That way we'll have it both when we do a new and an edit automatically. It'll be included on both of them. Remember, don't repeat yourself. Render partial, and the partial is going to be called error messages. And don't forget it's inside the shared folder. Now there's one other thing that we need to take care of, which we need to declare the locals that we'll be using. And the locals that we have in there is object. And object in this case will be equal to @subject. That's the thing we want to find out. Does it have errors? And by passing in a different object, I can reuse this partial. So let's save that and let's try it out. So we'll go into terminal, make sure that's still running. We'll go to Firefox and let's just try resubmitting the subject. So I just hit create subject again. So this time the create didn't take place, but it did give us a nice friendly error message letting us know what the problem was. Now if your error message doesn't look like mine, it's just because you haven't styled it with the CSS. I went ahead and pasted in some CSS earlier that had a style for this that made it look the way it does now. You can feel free to style it however you like. Now that we have it added to subject, we also are going to need to add it to pages and sections. But before we do, I want to go ahead and do one other thing, which is I want to add this to my helper so that I can call it as a helper method and make it even easier. What I want to do is take all of this code here that I just had, and I'm just going to cut it out of here, jump over to my application helper, and I'm going to create a new method here called error messages for, and it's going to take an object as its argument. So now I have exactly the same functionality that I had before. I can just call error messages for, pass it in an object, and here we go. But instead of subject, we're just going to pass along whatever object was passed in. It's still going to do everything else the same. It's just going to allow us to use error messages for instead. So I'll copy that, save it, close it up, and here error messages for the subject. Voila. And I'll just take that, copy it, and let's jump over to sections form. At the top of that, we'll do the same thing, but with section, and we'll jump over to pages and do the same thing with pages. Now, keep in mind, we don't have any validations on these yet, so we're not going to get any errors on them, but at least we have the error messages there ready. And it's a good idea whenever you create your form to go ahead and put the error message output at the top. So let's try it one more time, just make sure we didn't break anything. We'll come over to here and subjects create. Let's just try and submit it one more time. And yes, you can see we still get the same error message back.